Good morning, Facebook and chatters. So today I promised that we were going to make sandwich bread. I'm going to try not to say a lot, but I'm sorry, you guys. I just do. It's a holdover from something in my childhood, and it's just there. Sorry. So sandwich bread, and this recipe is probably the easiest recipe that you'll probably ever hear of. I think, if I can remember correctly, the first time I ever saw it was someone told me, oh, I use King Arthur's flour, and that's the recipe on the back of it. But it's pretty much basic to any recipe you Google. Really quick, really simple. Our actual time on this, and I'm going to try to cut it down so that you guys can watch with me, is about anywhere, depending on where you're from. And I say that because we're talking about altitude, we're talking about humidity levels, some scientific kind of things. Depending on where you are, this recipe can take anywhere from an hour and a half to like 3 hours till you get finished product, not including cooling time. So we're going to go over the ingredients real quick. 3 cups of flour. It can be almost any type of flour. I suggest all-purpose flour. You can use bread flour, you can use wheat flour, you can use a mix of a bread and a wheat flour, but I'm just using, this is for a regular old white bread, loaf of bread for sandwiches, white flour. A half cup of milk cold from the refrigerator, and 1/2 cup of hot water. So then you have a cup of liquid. Some recipes will call for you to scald the milk. That means to heat it up and get that little skin, pull it off. There you go. And melt your butter into the milk. You don't have to do that. Just a cup of milk, half cup of milk, half cup of hot water. 4 tablespoons of melted butter. Please use butter. Don't use margarine. You can use margarine. You can use vegetable oil. Your bread will taste so much better if you use whole milk and real butter. 2 tablespoons of sugar. And this is regular old sugar. This is not sweetener. This is not stevia. This is not any kind of, you can use Splenda if you're one of those people who's trying to be healthy, and you want to use some sort of an alternative, but seriously, the healthiest aspect for you is sugar. I would not use brown sugar in this recipe. You can get sugar in the raw, and that would be the only exception that I would say that you should do. But do not just go out and use brown sugar. It's just a different flavor to your bread. Brown sugar works more for dessert type things. And a tablespoon of active dry yeast. Now, you guys have heard the water running in the background for me this entire time. The reason that the water is running is because I needed to get it to the hottest level that I could get it without having to boil it. Water boils at what, like 112, right? Your water coming out of your faucet, depending on what you have your furnace on, can get to the temperature that it needs to bloom your yeast. So I put a tablespoon of active dry yeast in this cup, and we're going to add about 1/8 of a cup of water to it. It's really, it's hot to my finger. Now, the recipe itself calls for 1/4 cup of water. I'm only using 1/8 because I don't want to take all day to make this video for you. When you're dealing with yeast, you want to make sure that you mix your yeast in a glass or a plastic container. You want to make sure that you don't use any metal. The alloys and things in your metal forks and things will actually have an effect on the yeast. And things that you can do to help your yeast bloom. And bloom means that it's going to look like the head on a really good beer. It's going to get fluffy and expand with a little bit of water. Some tips that you can use is to bloom your yeast in, again, the warmest water that you can. Feed it. It's hungry. So you can add an extra little amount of sugar, not salt, sugar directly into your yeast mix. Or if you have a beer laying around or you have some beer, that's the reason that I only used 1/8 of a cup of water in this, because I'm going to add a couple of ounces, not a lot, of this Bud Light that someone left at my house. Um, the beer already has yeast and sugars in it, and that actually is just going to help speed up the process. It's going to feed this yeast, and it's going to take less time for it to begin to expand and wake up so that it can do what it needs to do for our bread. Okay. That usually takes about 5 minutes. So when you're making this recipe, that's the very first thing you want to start with. Get all your ingredients laid out so that you can just dump them in the mixer and go. Start by blooming your yeast. Okay. While the yeast is blooming, we're going to take a minute to talk about prepping your kitchen or your area to do this recipe. We talked about where you are, the latitude, how far from sea level you are, what the temperature is in your home. When you're baking breads that need yeast and you need to rise them, where you're placing them when they're in that rising stage is really key, and it's important. It needs to be a warm, moist, but not wet place. If you, like, it's summertime here, I'm in East Texas, or East-ish Texas, so it's really humid where I am. There's a lot of moisture in the ambient air outside, but because I'm running the air conditioner, there's not a lot of moisture in the house. Things that you can do to help that is when you're baking this bread or you're in the process of rising it, you can run your dishwasher or boil some water on the stove just to put a little bit of extra humidity and moisture into the air. When your bread is in the rising stage, you need to make sure that it's covered loosely with either a cheesecloth or a thin dishcloth, and it needs to be away from like moving air. So don't leave it directly under a spinning ceiling fan or a vent, which I'm standing under now, the air conditioner vent. It needs to be in a place where it's warm and with not a lot of movement where things can touch it and bother it, but with enough moisture in the air to keep the yeast going. Flour. The 3 cups of flour are loosely sifted, and by loosely sifted I mean I scooped it out of the bag and I kind of stirred it up in the bag as I scooped it and measured 3 cups into this big container. I added my 2 tablespoons of sugar and my 1 1/4 tablespoon of salt directly into this. You do not have to sift this flour. Now, if you don't have a mixer, someone asked that, I believe Kara asked that, do you have to have a mixer? No, but a mixer makes your life easier. And so I'm going to try to tip this down, and I'm sorry you guys are going to, in order to tip this so that you can see what I'm doing, you're going to see my boobs, and I'm sorry. So I put the flour, sugar, and salt has gone into the mixer. I'm just going to spin that real slowly because I want to add some air to the flour, and I want to make sure that the salt and sugar get mixed in. Okay? In less than 5 minutes, because we fed our yeast a little bit of beer and a little bit of sugar, this is ready to go. If you're not going to feed it and you get the water temperature just right, this takes about 3 to 5 minutes for it to be where it is. And that's a little over 1/4 cup of full liquid now. And it's just the foam. You don't want to let it bloom too long because it's going to bloom to the point that it uses all of its energy and then it's not going to do what it wants to do. So to the flour, the dry ingredients, we're going to go ahead and we're going to add this 4 tablespoons of melted butter. Now that's set out a little bit since I melted it before I started the video. So you make sure you get all of your butter. You want all the nice, fat, yummy stuff that's in that butter in there. And we're going to turn it on, and we're going to add, while it's spinning, we're going to add our milk and our water. Remember, it's a half a cup of cold milk and a half a cup of hot water. I'm going to stop it at this point because you don't want to overmix it, and you want to make sure that you can scrape down the sides. But when it's loosely mixed after you've added that and you've got kind of like a pancake consistency going, you need to move if you're working with a mixer, you got to scrape down the sides. Now we're going to add that yeast in. Real simple. You want to scrape the sides of the cup or container that your yeast was in. Now I know you guys are seeing me, and I put that yeast, I said don't put the yeast in anything that's metal, and then the bowl on my mixer is metal. Once you start mixing the yeast into the dough, that's not going to have too much of an effect on it. You want the yeast to be active when it starts. I'm going to mix this on high or medium for a couple of minutes, maybe 2. Until it forms a ball. Now, at this stage, if you were mixing this by hand, you would have mixed this into a kind of a little ball. It's clinging right there. And I'm going to bring this bowl over so that you can see. Maybe I'll just move the laptop so that you can see that it's all mixed up into a loose little ball right here. See if I can get that so you can see. So it's a loose ball. Now, if you're going to mix this with your mixer, you can mix this for between 3 to 5 minutes to mix it. You can take it out once it's in this loose ball and mix it on the counter. This is the same thing as kneading. Mixing it in the bowl is going to knead it for you so that you don't have to knead it. If you're making this by hand, once you've mixed it and it's in a ball in this consistency, this is the point where you would sprinkle a little bit of flour onto the countertop and then oil your hands, and then you would knead this for 5 minutes, 5 to 8 minutes. I am feeling kind of lazy today, so I'm not going to knead that. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to turn the mixer on high, and I'm going to let it do the work for me. Now I'm looking at this, and I know because I added a little bit of extra liquid with the beer that this is not forming. It's still sticky. It's not really making a ball. So what we're going to do, if you have that problem, you have too much moisture, don't flip out. Just take the flour that you've set aside to sift with. We're just going to add a little bit of flour to it, okay? Okay, so that's a couple of minutes of mixing and spinning it around. It's clinging to my dough hook. I'm going to show you what it looks like to get this out, and then I am not liking the way, for me personally, I'm not liking the way it's sticking. So it means I need a little more flour, and I'm going to need to pay attention to it by hand. Nothing wrong with that. It just means I'm going to have to work for it. So at this point, if you have any jewelry on, I would probably suggest you take that out, because yeast, dough in general, flour in general, on your hands is not great, but it's really not good for your wedding ring. So if you see a recipe and it says turn the dough out, turning the dough out just means that you are going to take it out of the pan. So a little bit of flour on my hands, and we're just going to scoop this out. And it's a little bit tacky to the touch. Tacky as in sticky, but it's a good ball. Feels like really soft Play-Doh right here. You want to get all of the dough out. Don't be lazy. Get it all out. So the two things, I said I was going to be lazy and I wasn't going to knead it. I'm going to knead it. You could knead it with the mixer for 5 to 6 minutes, a little less, but you can knead it by hand. Kneading dough, I can't even tell you what it means. It's part scientific. The friction that you're doing with kneading the dough moves the yeast around through it, continues to mix it. Sort of makes it a little tougher. You know, when you mix cake batter, it says don't overmix, because then the glutens and all that stuff. I'm not out and around. I can't tell you the whole thing. But if you overmix it, it makes it tougher. Well, you want to knead the flour and release the glutens and all that stuff that's in bread, because you want it to be thicker, denser than, you know, a moist cake. We don't have to, I'm not going to have to knead this for 5 to 8 minutes, simply because I mixed it longer in the mixer. This is kneading. Kneading is just folding it over, mashing it down, folding it over. Okay? That's kneading. You want to make sure that you always have enough flour down on your surface. We're not really adding any flour to the dough. You're just keeping it from sticking to your surface, keeping it from sticking to you. If you're going to knead by hand, probably should wear an apron. Alpha's going to see this video and be like, I hope she cleans that counter. And why doesn't she have on an apron? If you have problems with like arthritis, tendonitis, things where your hands are swelling, this is something that you can do. As a writer, I started honestly baking bread at the same time that I really started writing. I had problems with my hands because I worked in a beef plant for so long. Bada bing, bada boom. That's it. So some people will let this rise on the counter. Some people will put it in an oiled pan or a lightly oiled bowl. And you want to cover it and let it rise for about 60 minutes. And that's just letting it sit there and do what it's going to do. Let the yeast do what it does. Now, this is where I was telling you people that I baked a couple of loaves, and I'll show you one where the bread actually rose the way it was supposed to. But I was trying to use what they call a double rise method. So you would let it rise up until it's about twice its size, and then you would put it in your pan and let it rise again. Depending on where you are and the moisture in your home, the humidity level, and if you got your yeast activated correctly, you really don't need to let it rise for more than an hour. What I'm going to do today is put this in a bowl that I've got or even in the flour, not actually, in a bowl that I will oil, and I'm only going to let it rise for about 30 minutes. At that point, I will transfer it to this bread pan that's oiled, and I'll let it continue to rise for another 30 minutes. You don't want to handle the dough a lot once it's started the process of rising. Once it's risen, and then you see them, they let it rise, and then they punch it down and do whatever to it and knead it again. I find that depending on where you are and the humidity levels in your home and the type of yeast that you use, for sandwich bread particularly, it doesn't need to rise twice. So having said that, I'm going to go ahead and oil this. I went to Walmart. It's just a butter flavored cooking spray. You don't need a whole lot. I'm going to open this dough up and fold it over, so like a trifold, and it's basically in that in a dough pan, a bread pan shape. Once it's risen, and you can tell that it's been risen, it will be double that. So we're going to leave that alone. I'm going to cover it. I'm actually not going to put it in a bowl because there's no one here to mess with it, and I'm not going to clean up. And then we'll talk about alterations to things that you can do to alter this bread to be a different recipe. Just a piece of saran wrap, which I suck at. Doesn't have to be tight because you want the bread to be able to move. It's gonna like that. Yeah, I make my own sound effects. I hate cling wrap more than anything. The only reason we're doing that is kind of to trap whatever little moisture is in, and to keep things, bugs, if there's any dust that you might have, from falling down and getting on your bread. And I need to clean, so you guys are going to hear me doing that. And then I'm going to leave you to watch this bread rise. So, things that you can do to this bread, tricks that you can, how should I say, tricks that you can use with this recipe to make a different type of bread. Obviously, you can use a whole wheat flour, an unbleached wheat flour, if you're trying to be a little healthier. Here's the thing: bleached flour and wheat flour and white flour, all-purpose flour, same damn thing. One of them has just been chemically treated, so that it's white. That's what it is. Bleached flour. It's been cleaned so that it's white. Obviously, that means that it's not in its natural state, and it's had some chemical done to it. Other things that you can add to this are nuts and grains. You can, if you like a whole wheat bread that has sunflower seeds and poppy seeds or things of that nature, you can add those things to the bread. I would not use white flour at that point. That's the time that you want to use a wheat flour or a whole grain flour. same process. When you're using whole grains, you may need to increase the yeast content. I would start, when you're practicing that, I would start by going with a quarter teaspoon at a time to see how much yeast you need. Just depends on the type of flour you use. You can add flaxseed to it. And then, as I showed you guys last week, you can use cinnamon and raisin to make cinnamon raisin bread. To do that, you're just going to add about a tablespoon to 2 tablespoons of cinnamon. Depends on how much you want it to be sweet, sweet and cinnamony. And then about a quarter cup of raisins, quarter to a half cup of raisins. Just depends on how much raisin you want in your bread. You want to mix the bread for a couple of minutes before you add the raisins into it. The cinnamon can be added right in with the flour and your dry ingredients. Another neat trick with this particular recipe is that you can actually make donuts from this recipe. And I think I gave that recipe to Blue Williams a while back. To make donuts from this recipe is when you actually have to you come into the situation where you're letting it rise twice. What you're going to add to this recipe to get those donuts is an egg. 1 whole egg right into the mix. You want to whip it kind of lightly before you dump it in. You don't want to dump it in with the hot if you're scalding your milk to get it warm. Because then it'll fry your egg or start to cook your egg, and you don't want your egg cooked. So you want to lightly whip an egg, and then your milk, instead of just being cold milk mixed with hot water, you're going to go 1 whole cup of milk, no water. 1 whole cup of milk, and you're going to heat that milk either on the stove or in the microwave until it's hot. And then add that milk, butter, eggs, all into the bread dough, and then you'll add your yeast to the already mixing stuff. The warmth from the very hot milk and the warm dough is going to increase the activation of the yeast. Your yeast needs to already be bloomed, obviously, but the heat and the warmth of that dough at that point is going to bloom it. You'll pull it out and knead it just like we did, and then what you'll end up doing is rolling it out. You'll knead it for like 2 to 3 minutes. You'll roll it out, and then you'll take a cookie cutter and punch out your donut shapes. Pull the excess from around it. You know, if you're going to put holes in it, then you would take a smaller, a bottle or a small cookie cutter to make the holes in the center. Those donut holes, I would just set them aside and let them rise again. Cover that with a towel and let it rise. For the 30 minutes or whatever until the dough has doubled in its size. Once it's doubled in its size, then it's ready to fry. You would need your oil to be about 325, between 350 and 360. I don't know why I said 325. 350 to 360, and you want to fry them in small batches. If you don't have a deep fryer or something that you could put it in, you just use a pot with canola oil or vegetable oil. You can even use Crisco. I don't know what it is about lard. Crisco, lard, those things, and it just tastes so good. And you fry them up, bada bing, bada boom. You've just made homemade fresh donuts. Gonna leave you to watch this bread rise. You can see it's already kind of expanding a little bit. And I hope that my screen doesn't go black. Then once we edit this, hopefully you can see what's going on. Okay, so I'm back, and we're sitting at, this has been going for about 45, well, this whole video has been going for about 45 minutes. If you were watching this, you can see that it started to expand and rise. So what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to oil my hands just a little bit. And I'm going to not be too rough with this, but I'm just going to kind of manipulate it, stretch it, and do like a little trifold like we did earlier with it. You should be able to smell it. You're going to fold it over, trifold, kind of like you would do a letter, and then tuck the ends and transfer that into your pan. We're going to cover it. We're going to let this rise, continue to rise for about another 20 to 30 minutes, an hour. And actually what I'm going to do is move this over by the stove. The stove is actually not on, but what I do have to do going is my tea kettle, and it's boiling water just to put some extra moisture into the kitchen, as I said. And then we're going to let that go, and the bread is going to rise up. We want it to rise until it comes up and about a half an inch to an inch over the top of the pan. We'll do some stills and show you when that's done. Okay guys, so I've been trying to clean my kitchen so that I don't have a mess while I'm doing this. So I'm just going to turn this around, we're going to let it go, and then hopefully I will be able to edit all this together and you will see in sort of a time-lapse frame the bread rising. So we're just going to turn the laptop and you guys get to watch that. See you later. Okay guys, I'm back and I'm kind of taking to the side. So it is 10:10. Woo! And my recording stopped and I didn't realize it because I can only record for so long. But this is our bread. And I'm going to try to gently remove this plastic wrap because I don't want to cause it to sink, because that's bad. So it's not quite an inch, but it's about a half an inch, and that's fine because it's going to rise up just a little more in the baking process. The oven, we're going to let that rise for a few minutes more. We're going to bake this at 350 for 35 minutes. So we're just going to let this sit for just a little bit while the oven comes up to temp. And we'll pop it in as soon as the oven is preheated at 350. We're going to pop it in for 35 minutes. So I just wanted to take a moment to kind of poke my head back around the corner and say, if you're watching the video at this point, you can see that my bread is actually deflating just a little bit. The reason being because I forgot to oil the saran wrap. One way that you can do this so that you don't have to put saran wrap on it touching the bread, which can be a problem causing it to sink, is to make sure that you tint the saran wrap, or you put some sort of a dome. You can use a bowl, a mixing bowl, just over the top of the bread, so that it doesn't actually touch the bread, but it's protecting the bread, keeping anything from being on it, sealing in whatever moisture is in the bread. We're going to go ahead and put this in for 35 minutes. And then when it's done, I'm actually not going to come back and do a video, but when it's done, what I'll do is I'll come back and I'll take some still shots and pictures of it. Okay, so I lied again. I don't want to take pictures with my phone. I'm actually getting kind of tired, and this is taking longer than I wanted it to take, and I can't edit it to go very much faster than like a 40-minute video, which was not what I wanted to do. So we have baked the bread, and I'm about to get it out of the oven and show you the cooling process. Now, if I hadn't goofed and it kind of flattened a little bit, there we go. Golden brown after 35 minutes in the oven. Now, my favorite thing, well, it is my favorite thing. I kind of like it fresh out of the oven warm. I immediately take it out of the pan so that it can begin the cooking process. So there's our bread. There's the bottom of it. There's the top. Now, if it hadn't sank, it would have had just a little bit more of a dome on it. Again, you can keep it from sinking by not having anything touch the bread while it's rising. Easily, if you have a bowl big enough to go over the whole pan, that's a better way to do it. But this is how you know that your bread is done. I hope you can hear that. It's hollow. So that's sandwich bread. I have part of a loaf that I baked last weekend. Do not cut your bread while it's hot. Anybody who's ever cut any kind of bread knows, especially with sandwich bread, knows that if you cut your bread while it's hot, you usually will end up causing it to squish because it's too hot. You need to let it cool completely. But this is the texture. I baked this on Saturday. And like I said, usually it lasts me all week. It's a little smaller because you can see this is actually a smaller loaf than that because I was, again, practicing with letting it double rise without needing to. But that's the texture of the bread right there. I'm going to bring that in as close as I can. Don't know really where the thing is. Makes great sandwiches. Makes great French toast once it's really cool. And yeah, that's it. So I'm going to go upload this video, hopefully, and be done with this because I'm tired and I'm hungry and I want a sandwich.